Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for this event. Also, let me wish a belated happy SIG celebration to the members of the Ethiopian community who celebrated it yesterday. My subject today within the broader topic of our discussions is the emergence of the Beit Israel in Ethiopia. As some of you may know, I devoted part of a book almost 30 years ago to this topic. Much of what I'm going to say is reviewing some of what I've previously written, and I've attempted to make some reference to some of the more recent literature. While it is customary to begin any talk about the Beit Israel with the statement that there are several theories regarding their origins, for close to 40 years now, the dominant view of scholars who study Ethiopia has been that they are an ethnic group that emerged in that country between the 13th and 16th century. There still is a significant group of scholars, mainly in Israel, writing primarily in Hebrew, who argue that an early migration of Jews to Ethiopia is the source of the Beit Israel. It should be noted that in one way or another, the proponents of this view all posit that the history of the Jews in Ethiopia is a micro version of the larger story of the Jewish people. First, there were Jews, then there were Christians. The Jews lived for centuries in exile as a persecuted minority. Finally, the state of Israel was created and the Jews were returned from exile. Perhaps because of this view, they have a marked tendency to claim that supporters of the comparatively late ethnogenesis of the Beit Israel are claiming that the Beit Israel are not real Jews. To restate the obvious, historians, anthropologists, philologists, and ethnomusicologists do not determine who is a Jew. This is in the realm of the rabbis, like the Sephardi chief rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who you see in the picture, Israeli and rabbinical courts, the Knesset, and the Beit Israel's own self-definition, not necessarily in that order. None of the handful of early references to Jews in Northeast Africa before the 14th century appear to be reliable witnesses to the existence of the Beit Israel. Eldad Hadani, there's a quote from him here, was not an Ethiopian. In the 12th century, Benjamin of Tudela had no firsthand knowledge of the situation in Ethiopia. Indeed, it is noteworthy that neither the Arabic nor Ethiopic texts, nor the ever-expanding archaeological data on Ethiopia have revealed direct evidence of an early Jewish presence. The traditions of a rebel female ruler associated with the decline of ancient Aksum are still enticing, but the idea that she was named Gudit or Judith does not withstand serious scrutiny, and particularly so the claim that she was a Beit Israel, or as the 18th century Scottish explorer James Bruce called her, a Falasha. Having mentioned the term Falasha, which is today rejected by Ethiopian Jews because of its derogatory connotations, I must apologize that my presentation requires me to use it rather repeatedly because of its relevance to the historical discussion. The term appears in the Ethiopic Bible with the meaning of exile, such as in Ezra 4:1, and the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the Falasyan, the exiles, were building the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. Not surprisingly, for many years, scholars saw this as evidence that the Beit Israel were of external origin and had migrated to Ethiopia. However, the term does not appear as an ethnic identification before the 15th century, and perhaps even the 16th century. Indeed, the fact that in the first half of the 16th century, we find the term in Gez and used for the first time in Hebrew, Arabic, and Portuguese applied to a specific people would seem to indicate that it dates to that period. Moreover, among these earliest usages are several that stress that the Falasha in question are Jews, Ayhud, or at least non-Christians, Aramawi, which would seem to indicate that the term was not originally limited to an ethnic designation. Interestingly, it is in the same period that we hear for the first time from an Ethiopian source that these Jews are not locals, but that the Jews migrated to Ethiopia from Jerusalem. You see the text here. Interestingly, while this text uses the verb phalasu, it does not identify them as Phalasha, which would seem to indicate that the author, at least, was not familiar with that ethnic designation. One theory regarding the term Phalasha is that it refers to landlessness, the fact that non-Christians in medieval Ethiopia could not own land. Thus, as the Christian kingdom expanded from the 13th century onward, non-Christians were deprived of the right to own land. According to a text attributed to the 15th century Emperor Yitzhak, the Beit Israel who opposed him and were compelled to and did not convert would become Phalassi. Next slide, and next after that. Okay. I got them out of order. A later note says, since then the Beit Israel are called Phalasoch. Whether this is the origin of the term or a creative etymology is not clear. Now, the loss of land means that these renegades retreated into undesirable, inhospitable lands, such as the Simeon Mountains, and worked as tenant farmers and supplemented their income by working as craftsmen, smiths, and potters. I think we'll hear more about the smiths in one of our lectures. These processes were described in detail by James Quirin, originally in his 1977 doctoral dissertation and later in the book that you see above. Quirin's work, which is largely based on oral traditions gathered in Ethiopia, notes that because of the stigma associated with many of these crafts, the Beit Israel became a despised caste-like group, necessary for their skills, but feared and avoided because of the dangers they posed, because of the evil eye, and their ability to shift shape into hyenas. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese priest Francisco Alvarez noted that in the royal tent city, the smiths lived next to the prostitutes, two necessary but despised professions side by side. Yet another meaning of the term Phalasa or Phalassi is a monk. Although monasticism existed in Ethiopia from the first centuries after the introduction of Christianity, there was a major increase in its significance with the emergence of anti-royal monastic movements in several regions in opposition to the Solomonic kings. Each of these movements seems to have developed during the period when the local population, and particularly the nobility, came under pressure from these kings. The 15th century Stephanite monastic movement used the term Phalassi to refer to other monastic groups. And they themselves were called Phalassa by their enemies. It is during this period that the Beit Israel's own tradition tell us that monasticism was brought to them by the monks Abba Sabra and Saga Amlak in the 15th century. Thus, for hundreds of years, the Beit Israel had a religious hierarchy which consisted of monks, priests, deacons, and dabtaras. Important dimensions of our understanding of monasticism have been added in recent years. Here you see a map of some of the sites that are being investigated by some young scholars, Verena Krebs, Sophia Degemuller, who we'll be hearing from in a few minutes, and Bar Kribus, who completed a doctorate at Hebrew University recently on this topic. And you can once again see the map and see the range of sites. Now, it should be noted that these monks were also credited with introducing strict purity laws to the Beit Israel. Already in the 1970s, Kay Kaufman-Shilme, in her book, Music, Ritual, and Phalasha History, demonstrated that the Beit Israel liturgy was derived from the Ethiopian Christian monastic tradition. Her findings provoked strong reactions, including calls for her book not to be sold in New York's Jewish Museum gift shop. Only recently, a large French-Israeli project, which began in 1985, was completed. The team did massive work documenting and preserving performances of the liturgy in Israel. One can imagine a series of studies comparing their material with previous recordings such as Leslaus and, of course, Shilames. While at least some members of this group repeatedly told anyone who would listen that they were going to refute Shilame's findings, this is certainly not evident in the material published to date. Indeed, the fact that in the course of over 30 years, the team does not appear to have figured out how to transliterate Gez in a consistent fashion leaves me skeptical as to their ability to deal with the far more complex issue of interpreting words when they're being sung. They also ignore or were ignorant of two recently published collections of liturgical texts. Here you see one by Monica Devins, another one by Denise Margaret Hayon. Once again, a comparison between these published texts and the performed liturgy would be a valuable addition to our understanding of Beit Israel ritual. This leads me finally to Beit Israel literature. Our next speaker, Sophia, will discuss the manuscript tradition in depth. Note that in addition to their canonical works, the Beit Israel possess a number of later works. This was once the most researched area of Beit Israel culture. However, in recent years, it's been relatively neglected. Fortunately, several efforts are underway to study specific works based on a wider collection of manuscripts. It is certainly time for the publication of a new Beit Israel anthology of texts and translations. It is already clear that most of these texts are adapted from Christian originals and may have been brought by monks who joined the Beit Israel. Moreover, while some of them go back to earlier Jewish sources, the versions the Beit Israel have can be shown to be based on Christian originals which reached Ethiopia, often in Christian Arabic. Given that we know that translations from Arabic to Gez began in the 13th or 14th century, the Beit Israel versions cannot be earlier than this, nor it is likely that the Beit Israel themselves could have performed such translations. To summarize, we were able to date elements of Beit Israel culture when we are trying to date elements of Beit Israel culture, we keep coming back to the 13th through 16th century. The Beit Israel may have existed earlier, but if they did, they had a different name, lived in different regions, had a different religious hierarchy, had different economic specializations, and had different liturgy and religious literature. I think we can agree that these characteristics are what we mean when we talk about a group's cultural identity. The burden of proof is certainly on those who wish to claim that certain elements are ancient and early. By any measure, those who argue for the emergence of the Beit Israel in medieval Ethiopia have done significant work over recent decades and continue to enrich our understanding of this fascinating chapter in Ethiopian history. Thank you.